The scream that tore through the Wyoming mountain air that September morning in 1878 was not one of fear but of pure frustration. And it stopped Samuel Rutherford dead in his tracks as he hauled a fresh killed elk across his broad shoulders. He stood there on the pine needle path, his muscled frame going still as stone, listening to determine if someone was in danger or merely vexed. The sound came again, this time more of an anguished wail followed by what could only be sobbing, and Samuel's jaw tightened beneath his thick beard. He had come down from his cabin higher in the mountains to trade pelts in the settlement of Quartz Hill, California's northern neighbor, but that was still 2 days' walk from here. This crying was coming from one of the homesteads that dotted the foothills, those brave or foolish enough to try making a life in this unforgiving territory. Samuel shifted the elk carcass, his powerful arms flexing as he adjusted the weight, and moved toward the sound. His long, dark hair, which fell past his shoulders, swayed with each step. He had learned long ago that ignoring trouble in these mountains often meant finding frozen corpses come winter or worse. The September air already carried the promise of early snow, and anyone struggling out here needed help whether they wanted to admit it or not. He crested a small rise and saw the cabin below, a modest structure with a stone chimney sending up a thin trail of smoke. Outside, sitting on a wooden stool near the door, was a young woman bent over what appeared to be a spinning wheel, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its bun, falling around her face as she stared at the broken equipment before her. Even from this distance, Samuel could see the wheel was tilted at an odd angle, one of its supports clearly snapped. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, but his boots crunched on the rocky ground and she looked up with a gasp. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with a face that would have been pretty if not contorted with distress. She wore a simple calico dress that had been mended multiple times and her hands were rough with work. "Madam," Samuel said, his voice a deep rumble that came from somewhere in his chest. "Heard you crying. Everything all right?" She wiped at her face quickly, embarrassment flooding her features. "I am fine, sir. Just having a difficult morning is all." Samuel lowered the elk to the ground, his muscles rippling beneath his buckskin shirt as he did so. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms thick as tree branches. Years of surviving alone in the mountains had carved him into something more force of nature than man, but his gray eyes were gentle as he looked at the woman. "That spinning wheel does not look fine," he observed, nodding toward the broken equipment. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks and she looked away, as if ashamed to be seen crying by a stranger. "It broke this morning. The support leg just snapped clean through while I was working. I have 3 blankets I need to finish before the trading post owner comes through next week, and now I cannot complete even one of them. I have been saving wool for months, and without those blankets to trade, I will not have enough supplies to make it through winter." Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her hands to her face. Samuel stood there, studying the situation with the same careful assessment he used when tracking game. The cabin looked well maintained but poor. The woman was alone, which meant either widowed or unmarried, and either situation was dangerous this far from civilization. The broken spinning wheel represented more than just inconvenience. It was potentially a death sentence. "May I take a look at it?" he asked. She lowered her hands, looking at him with surprise. "You know about spinning wheels?" "I know about wood and how things fit together," Samuel replied. "Mind if I examine it?" She stood up quickly, gesturing to the wheel. Please, if you think you can help. I am sorry, I have not even introduced myself. I am Jane Thompson. Samuel Rutherford, he said, moving closer to crouch beside the spinning wheel. Up close, he could smell her scent, a mixture of wood smoke and lavender, and something tightened in his chest that he firmly pushed away. He had not been this close to a woman in over 3 years, not since he had left civilization behind after his parents died, and this was not the time to be thinking about such things. He examined the broken support leg carefully, running his calloused fingers over the split wood. The break was clean, but the wood itself was old and dried out, probably weakened over time. The wheel itself was a simple design but well crafted, likely brought across the plains in a wagon at great expense and care. "This can be fixed," he said after a moment. Jane made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Truly. The nearest carpenter is in Quartz Hill, 3 days' ride from here, and I do not have a horse. I have been trying to think of how to manage it, but I cannot leave the cabin unattended for that long, and I cannot carry the wheel that far anyway." Samuel stood up, his full height seeming to tower over her. "I can fix it here. Need to fashion a new support leg and reinforce the others so this does not happen again. Will take me most of the day, but it can be done." She stared at him as if he had just offered her the moon. "You would do that?" "But I cannot pay you, not until I have traded the blankets, and even then—" "Did not ask for payment," Samuel interrupted. "Just asked if you minded me fixing it." "I do not mind at all," Jane said quickly, fresh tears springing to her eyes, though these seemed to be from relief rather than despair. "Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Thank you so much." "Samuel is fine," he said, already scanning the area for suitable wood. "You have any tools?" "A saw and knife, something for shaping wood." "My late husband's tools are in the shed," Jane replied, and there it was, the answer to his unspoken question. Widow then, and recent enough that the grief still colored her voice when she mentioned him. "I will show you." She led him to a small shed behind the cabin, walking with quick, nervous steps as if afraid he might change his mind and disappear back into the mountains. The shed was organized but dusty, clearly not used much since her husband's passing. Samuel selected what he needed: a saw, a plane, a good knife, and some other implements. The tools were quality, well cared for, and he wondered what had happened to the man who owned them. "How long have you been alone out here?" he asked as he carried the tools back to the spinning wheel. Jane wrapped her arms around herself. 6 months. Thomas, my husband, was killed in a rockslide while checking our trap lines. He was 26. We had only been married 2 years. "I am sorry," Samuel said, and meant it. 26 was too young to die, and leaving a wife alone in this territory was a hard fate for both of them. "He was a good man," Jane said softly. "Taught me how to survive out here, how to hunt small game, how to preserve food, how to keep the cabin maintained. But he never taught me much about the spinning wheel. His mother had given it to us as a wedding present, and she tried to show me the basics, but I never truly mastered it. Thomas always said we would have time for me to learn properly later." She fell silent, and Samuel did not press. He had his own ghosts, his own later that never came moments. Instead, he set to work finding a suitable piece of wood for the support leg. He left the elk carcass in the shade and told Jane he would need to search the nearby tree line for the right timber. "I will put on some coffee," she offered. "And I have some bread from yesterday if you are hungry." Samuel's stomach chose that moment to remind him that he had been walking since before dawn. "That would be appreciated, madam." "Jane," she corrected with a small smile, the first he had seen from her. It transformed her face, chasing away some of the grief and exhaustion. "If I am calling you Samuel, you should call me Jane." He nodded and headed into the trees. It took him about 20 minutes to find what he needed: A sturdy piece of pine with a straight grain, thick enough to provide proper support. He cut it free with practiced efficiency, his muscles working easily despite the physical labor. This was the kind of task that felt natural to him, working with his hands to solve a practical problem. When he returned to the cabin, Jane had set out a simple meal on a wooden table outside. Dark bread, butter, some cold venison, and 2 cups of steaming coffee. She had also washed her face and pinned her hair back up, though several strands still escaped to frame her face. "I hope this is sufficient," she said. "I am afraid my pantry is not well stocked at the moment." "This is a feast compared to what I usually eat," Samuel assured her, settling onto the bench. It creaked under his weight but held. "Most days I am lucky if I have time to cook meat before eating it." Jane sat across from him, picking at her own food. "You live up in the high mountains." "Have a cabin about 10 miles north of here, higher up where the big game runs. Been there 3 years now. Alone. Alone." She studied him with open curiosity, and he let her look. He knew what she saw. A man who had more in common with the bears and wolves than with civilized folk, someone who had chosen isolation over community. His clothes were buckskin and fur, his beard was thick and untrimmed, and his hair hung loose past his shoulders because he could not be bothered to cut it. But his eyes were clear and his hands were steady, and he saw the moment she decided he was safe. "That must be lonely," she said quietly. "Sometimes," Samuel admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "But loneliness is safer than some alternatives." Jane nodded as if she understood, and maybe she did. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the mountain air crisp and clean around them. Samuel found himself noticing small details about her. The way she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup for warmth, the faint scar on her left wrist, the way her eyes kept drifting to the broken spinning wheel as if afraid it might disappear. After they finished eating, Samuel got to work in earnest. He measured the broken support leg carefully, then began shaping the new piece of pine to match. His hands moved with practiced confidence, the knife peeling away thin curls of wood that fell to the ground like snow. Jane watched for a while, then went inside and returned with a basket of wool and a pair of knitting needles. "I cannot spin, but I can at least work on something while you fix the wheel," she explained, settling back onto her stool. They worked in silence for a long time, the only sounds the scrape of Samuel's knife and the soft click of Jane's needles. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the cool morning air. Samuel found himself stealing glances at Jane, watching the way her fingers moved deftly through the wool, creating something from nothing. There was something peaceful about working alongside her, something that eased a tension in his chest he had not realized was there. "How did you end up out here?" Jane asked eventually. "If you do not mind me asking." Samuel considered the question while he tested the fit of the new support leg. Parents had a farm in Missouri. Both died of fever within a week of each other 4 years back. Sold the farm, could not stand to stay there without them, and just started walking west. Ended up here and decided to stay. No siblings, no wife. Brother died in the war, never married. He paused, then added, "Came close once, but she married someone else while I was helping my father with the farm, probably for the best." Jane made a soft sound of sympathy. "I am sorry, that must have been painful. Was a long time ago." Samuel fit the new leg into place, checking the angle. "What about you? You from around here originally?" "Pennsylvania," Jane said. "My family moved west when I was 16, settled in Quartz Hill. Met Thomas there when I was 19. We wanted our own land, our own place away from town, so we built this cabin. His parents thought we were foolish, but we were happy here." Her voice caught on the last word and she fell silent, focusing intently on her knitting. Samuel let her have her grief, understanding that some wounds were too fresh to probe. He had his own scars he preferred not to examine too closely. The repair took longer than he initially estimated because once he started, Samuel realized the entire wheel needed reinforcement. The wood was old and the mountain climate was hard on it, causing shrinkage and stress. He ended up replacing not just the one support leg but reinforcing all of them, adjusting the joints, and even tightening the wheel itself. His hands worked steadily, the familiar task of woodworking soothing in its rhythm. Jane brought out more coffee around midday, along with some dried apple slices. "You are doing so much more than I expected," she said, watching him work. "I thought you would just replace the one leg." "If I just replace the one leg, another will break in a month or two," Samuel explained, running his thumb along a joint. "Better to do it right while I am here." "I do not know how to thank you properly." Samuel looked up at her, meeting her eyes. They were hazel, he noticed, more green than brown in the afternoon light. "You already fed me, that is thanks enough. That was just bread and coffee. Out here, that is hospitality." He returned to his work, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her gaze. He had not done anything special, just what any decent person would do when they found someone in need. By late afternoon, the spinning wheel was not only repaired but sturdier than it had probably been when new. Samuel tested each joint, spun the wheel several times to check for wobble, and pronounced it ready. Jane stood up from her stool, setting aside her knitting, and approached cautiously as if afraid the wheel might fall apart again. "Go ahead and test it," Samuel encouraged. She sat down at the wheel, her hands finding their positions automatically. She began to pedal and the wheel spun smoothly, the familiar whir filling the air. But almost immediately, Samuel could see the problem. Her posture was wrong, her hands were positioned incorrectly, and the tension on the wool was inconsistent. She was fighting the wheel rather than working with it, and after only a minute she stopped, frustration clear on her face. "It still is not working right," she said, close to tears again. "I am doing something wrong." "The wheel is fine," Samuel said gently, "but your technique needs work. May I?" She looked up at him, confused. "You know how to spin." "My mother was an excellent spinner," Samuel explained, moving to stand beside her. "She taught me when I was young, said every person should know how to make what they need to survive. I have not done it in years, but I remember the basics." He had Jane stand up and took her place at the wheel, his large frame looking almost comical on the delicate stool. But when his hands touched the wool and his feet found the pedal, muscle memory took over. He began to spin, his movements sure and steady despite his size. The wool drew out into an even thread, winding onto the spindle with smooth consistency. Jane watched with wide eyes. "That is beautiful." "I have never been able to make it look that even." Samuel stopped and stood, gesturing for her to take his place. "The key is in how you hold your hands and how you control the pedal. You are gripping too tight and pumping too fast. Spinning is about rhythm and patience, not force." He positioned himself behind her as she sat down, then hesitated. "May I guide your hands? It is easier to show than explain." "Please," Jane said, looking up at him over her shoulder. Samuel reached around her carefully, keeping his touch professional despite the sudden awareness of her warmth, the scent of lavender in her hair. He positioned her hands on the wool, adjusting her grip. "Hold it gently, like you are holding a baby bird. You want to guide the wool, not strangle it." His hands covered hers, so large that they completely engulfed her smaller fingers. He could feel her pulse racing beneath his touch, quick and fluttering. Now the pedal, slow and steady, finding a rhythm, like a heartbeat. He guided her through the motion, his foot tapping a steady beat beside hers. See how the wheel responds when you keep the rhythm consistent. The wool feeds itself through at an even rate. You are not fighting it anymore. Jane's breathing had changed, coming faster, but she focused on the task. Slowly, under his guidance, an even thread began to form. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, I can feel the difference." "That is it," Samuel encouraged, his voice low near her ear. "You have it now. Keep that rhythm going." They worked together for several minutes, his hands gradually loosening their grip as she found her confidence. When he finally stepped back, Jane continued spinning on her own, producing a thread that, while not perfect, was infinitely better than her earlier attempts. "I am doing it," she said, wonder in her voice. "I am actually doing it properly." "You are a quick learner," Samuel said, pleased. He had forgotten the satisfaction of teaching someone a skill, watching them grasp something new. Jane continued for another few minutes before stopping, turning to face him with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "Thank you, Samuel, truly. You have saved my life today. Without those blankets to trade, I do not know what I would have done come winter." Samuel felt uncomfortable again under the weight of her gratitude. "You would have found a way. You are stronger than you think." "I do not feel strong," Jane admitted quietly. "Most days I feel like I am barely holding on, pretending I know what I am doing out here alone." "That is what being strong is," Samuel said. "Doing what needs to be done even when you are scared." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "Will you stay for supper? It is the least I can offer after everything you have done today." Samuel knew he should decline, should gather his elk and continue on his way. He had already spent most of the day here, and getting involved in other people's lives was dangerous. It made you care, made you vulnerable, made you remember what loneliness actually felt like when you went back to your empty cabin. But looking at Jane's hopeful face, he found himself nodding. "I would like that," he heard himself say. Jane's smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. "Wonderful. Let me see what I can put together. It will not be fancy, but it will be hot and filling." She hurried inside, and Samuel stood there, wondering what he had just agreed to. He should leave. He should absolutely leave right now before this became complicated. But instead, he found himself gathering his elk carcass and hanging it properly from a tree branch to keep it safe from scavengers, accepting that he would be staying at least through the meal. While Jane cooked, Samuel busied himself with small tasks around the cabin exterior. He noticed the woodpile was getting low and spent an hour splitting more logs, his powerful arms swinging the axe with rhythmic precision. He checked the roof for loose shingles and found several that needed securing before winter snows came. He reinforced the latch on the shed door that had been hanging loose. Small things, but each one potentially important for a woman surviving alone. Jane emerged from the cabin as he was stacking the last of the split wood. "Supper is ready," she called, then noticed the much larger woodpile. "Samuel, you have done too much already." "Just keeping busy," he said, brushing wood chips from his shirt. "Noticed a few things that needed attention." She shook her head but was smiling. "Come inside before everything gets cold." Samuel ducked through the cabin door, having to mind his head on the frame. Inside was cozy and well-kept, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and simple but sturdy furniture throughout. The cabin was one room with a sleeping area curtained off in the corner, everything organized with careful efficiency. It smelled like home, like the farmhouse he had grown up in, and something twisted painfully in his chest. Jane had set the table with 2 plates, 2 cups, and serving dishes containing venison stew, cornbread, and stewed greens. Steam rose from everything, filling the cabin with rich aromas that made Samuel's stomach growl despite the bread he had eaten earlier. "This looks incredible," he said honestly. "Sit, please." Jane urged, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I am just glad to have someone to cook for. It has been so long since I had company." They settled at the table and Jane served them both generous portions. The food was simple but excellent, seasoned well and cooked perfectly. Samuel ate with appreciation, and Jane seemed pleased by his obvious enjoyment. "You are a good cook," he said between bites. "My mother insisted I learn before we moved west," Jane replied. She said a woman needed to know how to make something satisfying out of whatever ingredients were available. I used to think she was being old-fashioned, but now I am grateful for every lesson she gave me. "Is your mother still in Quartz Hill?" Jane's expression clouded. "She died 2 years ago. Winter fever took her. My father followed 6 months later. I think he died of a broken heart as much as illness." "I am sorry. Seems like you have lost a lot of people." "The West is beautiful but unforgiving," Jane said quietly. "Thomas used to say that all the time." I did not fully understand until he was gone. They ate in silence for a moment before Jane asked, "Do you ever get lonely up in your cabin? Really lonely, I mean." Samuel considered the question while he chewed. "Yes," he admitted finally. "More than I thought I would when I first went up there. I thought I wanted solitude, wanted to get away from people and all the pain that comes with caring about them. But there is a difference between being alone and being lonely." "What is the difference?" "Being alone is a choice. Being lonely is what happens when you realize that choice has costs." Jane nodded slowly. "I understand that. Some days the silence in this cabin is so loud I want to scream just to break it. Why stay then? Why not move back to Quartz Hill where there are other people?" "Because Thomas and I built this place together," Jane said simply. "Because this cabin holds all my memories of him, and leaving feels like abandoning him all over again. And because I am too stubborn to admit defeat." Samuel found himself smiling despite the serious topic. "Stubbornness is a useful quality for surviving out here." "Is that why you stay in the mountains?" "Stubbornness, partly," Samuel admitted. "Also pride. I told myself I was going to make it alone, and admitting I need other people feels like failure." "But you came to help me today," Jane pointed out. "That does not seem like someone who has completely cut himself off from caring." Samuel had no good answer for that, so he focused on his food. Jane let him have his silence, seeming to understand that she had touched on something he was not ready to examine. After supper, Jane insisted on showing Samuel her progress on the wool she needed to spin. She lit several candles as the sun set, casting the cabin in warm, golden light, and sat at her spinning wheel. With the corrections Samuel had taught her, she was already producing much more consistent thread, though her rhythm still needed practice. "How long will it take you to make the 3 blankets?" Samuel asked, watching her work. "If I can spin every day, probably 2 weeks to produce all the yarn I need, then another week to weave it. That gives me just enough time before the trading post owner arrives." "What if your technique slips? What if you forget what I showed you?" Jane's hands faltered on the wheel. "I do not know. I suppose I will do my best and hope it is good enough." Samuel found himself speaking before he fully thought through what he was saying. "I could come back, check on your progress, make sure you are keeping the technique right." Jane's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "You would do that? Come back down from your cabin just to check on me?" Now that he had said it, Samuel felt committed. "I come down this way every few weeks anyway to check my trap lines. Would not be much trouble to stop by." That was not entirely true. His trap lines were in a different direction, and coming here would add hours to his journey. But looking at Jane's hopeful face, he found he did not care about the inconvenience. "I would like that very much," Jane said softly. "It gets lonely here, and having someone to talk to, even briefly, would mean a great deal." Samuel nodded, ignoring the warning bells going off in his head. He was getting involved, getting attached, exactly what he had promised himself he would never do again. But he had already committed and he would not take back his word. "I should head out," he said, standing up. "Want to cover some ground before it gets full dark." Jane stood as well, following him to the door. "Thank you again, Samuel, for everything. The wheel, the lessons, the wood, all of it. You have given me hope when I had none." "You are welcome, Jane." He paused at the door, looking down at her. She seemed so small standing there, so fragile despite the strength he knew she possessed. An urge to protect her rose up in him, fierce and unexpected. "Keep the rifle loaded and near the door. You are alone out here, and not all threats walk on four legs." "I will," she promised. Samuel retrieved his elk from where he had hung it and shouldered the carcass easily. Jane watched from the doorway, lamplight spilling out around her into the gathering darkness. "When will you come back?" she called as he started down the path. 3 days, Samuel found himself saying. "I will come back in 3 days to check your progress." "I will be here," Jane said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Samuel walked into the dark forest, his mind churning with conflicting thoughts. He had just promised to return, had opened a door he had kept firmly shut for 3 years. But as he replayed the day in his mind, remembered the way Jane's face had lit up when the spinning wheel worked, the sound of her laugh when she finally got the rhythm right, he found he did not regret his decision. The next 3 days passed slowly for Samuel. He went about his usual tasks, checking his actual trap lines, hunting, preserving meat for the coming winter, but his mind kept drifting to Jane alone in her cabin, working at her spinning wheel. He found himself wondering if she was maintaining the proper technique, if she had enough firewood, if she was eating properly. It irritated him, this preoccupation with someone else's well-being, but he could not seem to stop it. When the 3rd day arrived, Samuel packed a haversack with extra supplies before he fully thought through what he was doing. Some jerky, dried fruit, coffee beans he had been saving. Things Jane might need. He told himself he was just being practical, but the truth was harder to ignore. He wanted to take care of her, wanted to see that smile again. The walk to Jane's cabin took most of the morning, and as he approached, he could hear the familiar whir of the spinning wheel. The sound made him smile despite himself. She was working, keeping at it, not giving up. He had known she was strong. Jane must have heard his footsteps because she looked up from the wheel, her face breaking into a radiant smile when she saw him. "Samuel, you came back," said I would, he replied, noting how much healthier she looked than 3 days ago. The despair that had haunted her eyes was gone, replaced by purpose and determination. "Come, let me show you my progress," she said eagerly, gesturing to several skeins of completed yarn hanging from hooks on the wall. "I have been spinning every day, practicing the technique you taught me." "Is it good enough?" Samuel examined the yarn carefully, testing the consistency and thickness. It was not perfect, but it was solid work, much better than what she had been producing before. "This is good, Jane. You have been practicing." "Every spare moment," she confirmed. "I wake up thinking about rhythm and tension. I dream about spinning wheels, but it is working, and that is all that matters." She looked so proud, so accomplished, that Samuel felt warmth spreading through his chest. "You should be proud. This is fine work. Thanks to you." Jane wiped her hands on her apron. "I made extra food this morning, hoping you would come. Are you hungry?" Samuel had eaten before leaving, but he found himself nodding anyway. Sitting at Jane's table, sharing a meal with her, had occupied his thoughts more than he cared to admit over the past 3 days. They ate together, the conversation flowing more easily than the first time. Jane told him about a fox that had been raiding her chicken coop and how she had finally outsmarted it. Samuel talked about tracking a mountain lion that had been prowling near his cabin. They discussed the upcoming winter, comparing notes on weather signs and preparation strategies. After the meal, Samuel checked the repairs he had made on his previous visit, ensuring everything was still solid. Then, without really planning to, he found himself asking if Jane wanted to practice her spinning technique while he watched. "I would love that," Jane said. "I want to make sure I have not developed any bad habits." She sat at the wheel and began to spin while Samuel observed. Her form was much improved, though he noticed a few small issues with hand positioning. He moved to stand beside her, then hesitated. "May I?" he asked, as he had before. "Please," Jane said, and there was something in her voice, something warm and inviting that made Samuel's pulse quicken. He moved behind her again, reaching around to adjust her hands. This time he was more aware of her proximity, of the way her hair smelled like lavender, of the warmth of her body so close to his. His hands lingered on hers longer than strictly necessary, and he felt her lean back slightly, her shoulders brushing against his chest. "Like this?" Jane asked, her voice breathless. "Yes," Samuel managed, "just like that. You are doing very well." They stayed like that for several moments, spinning together, and Samuel felt something shifting between them. The air seemed charged, heavy with possibility. When he finally stepped back, Jane turned to look at him, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming back, for caring enough to check on me." "I said I would," Samuel repeated, but they both knew it was more than just keeping his word. Samuel stayed longer than he intended, helping Jane with various tasks around the cabin. He reinforced her chicken coop against the fox, checked the integrity of her root cellar, and even helped her card some wool. As the sun began to set, he found himself reluctant to leave. "Will you come back again?" Jane asked as he prepared to go. "Do you want me to?" The question came out before he could stop it. "Yes," Jane said without hesitation. "Very much yes. Then I will come back in a few days. Keep practicing your spinning." "I will," she promised. As Samuel walked back to his cabin that night, he acknowledged what he had been trying to deny. He was not just helping a neighbor in need anymore. He was courting her, whether he had consciously decided to or not. And judging by the way Jane had looked at him, the way she had smiled, she was not opposed to being courted. The realization should have terrified him. He had spent 3 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself he was better off alone. But Jane had somehow slipped past those defenses without even trying, just by being herself, by needing him and letting him help her. Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel found excuses to visit Jane's cabin for more times. Each visit lasted longer than the last, the conversation flowing more freely, the silences more comfortable. He helped her with her spinning, taught her better techniques for carding wool, and even showed her how to set snares for rabbit to supplement her diet. In return, she cooked meals that reminded him of home, mended a tear in his buckskin jacket, and made him feel less like a wild creature and more like a man again. On what was meant to be his 6th visit, Samuel arrived to find Jane frustrated with her weaving. She had finished spinning all the yarn and had set up a large floor loom in the corner of her cabin, but the first blanket was going poorly. "The tension is all wrong," she said, close to tears. "The weave is loose in some places and too tight in others. This will not be suitable for trading." Samuel examined the work, noting the problem immediately. "Your warp threads are not evenly tensioned. See how these are looser than those. But how do I fix it? If I take it all apart and start over, I will not have time to finish 3 blankets before the trading post owner arrives." "Show me how you set up the warp," Samuel instructed. Jane walked him through her process, and he identified several issues with her technique. His mother had not been a weaver, but he had watched enough skilled craftspeople work to understand the principles involved. Together, they adjusted the loom, redistributing tension until the warp threads were properly balanced. "Now try weaving a few rows," he suggested. Jane worked the loom carefully, and this time the fabric that emerged was even and tight, exactly what was needed for a warm blanket. She made a sound of relief that turned into a laugh. "It is working! Oh, thank heavens, it is actually working!" Her joy was infectious, and Samuel found himself grinning. "Keep at it. You are doing fine." Jane worked for another hour while Samuel watched, occasionally offering suggestions. When she finally stopped, satisfied with her progress, she turned to him with shining eyes. "I could not do any of this without you," she said. "You know that, do not you? You have saved me in every way a person can be saved." Samuel felt his throat tighten. "You are doing the work yourself, Jane. I am just pointing you in the right direction. You are doing so much more than that." Jane stood up from the loom, moving closer to him. "You have given me hope, companionship, purpose. You have made me feel less alone." "You have done the same for me," Samuel admitted quietly. They stood there, looking at each other, and Samuel felt the moment stretching out between them, heavy with unspoken words. He wanted to tell her what he was feeling, wanted to explain that she had become the reason he woke up each morning, that thoughts of her filled every quiet moment. But the words stuck in his throat, tangled up with old fears and protective instincts. Jane reached out slowly and touched his hand where it rested on the back of a chair. Her fingers were soft despite their work roughness, and Samuel felt the touch like a brand. "Stay for supper," she said softly. "Stay longer than usual. Please." Samuel knew he should refuse, should maintain some distance before this became something he could not walk away from. But looking into Jane's eyes, he realized it was already too late for that. He had passed the point of no return weeks ago. "I would like that," he said. That night was different from the others. They lingered over the meal, talking about deeper things, sharing stories from their pasts. Jane told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about dreams she had once had for a different life. Samuel talked about his family, about his brother who died at Gettysburg, about the woman he had almost married before duty called him home. "Do you regret not marrying her?" Jane asked. Samuel thought about it honestly. "I did for a long time, but now I think it happened the way it was meant to. If I had married her, I would not be here now." "And you are happy you are here, right now, in this moment?" "Yes, I am happy I am here." Jane smiled at him across the table, and Samuel felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. He was in love with her, he realized. Completely, irrevocably in love with this brave, stubborn, beautiful woman who had somehow found room in his closed-off heart. After supper, they sat by the fireplace as full darkness fell outside. Samuel knew he should leave, should start the walk back to his cabin, but Jane had settled close beside him on the bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he could not bring himself to move. "Samuel," Jane said eventually, her voice quiet, "what are we doing?" "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. These visits, the way we look at each other, the way I feel when you are here versus when you are gone. What are we doing?" Samuel took a deep breath. It was time for honesty, even if it terrified him. "I am courting you, Jane, or trying to. I am not very practiced at it." Jane turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Is that what you want, to court me?" "More than I have wanted anything in a very long time," Samuel admitted. "But I do not know if I would be good for you. I have been alone so long, I am not sure I remember how to be with someone else." "I have been widowed 6 months," Jane said. "By some standards I should still be in mourning, but Thomas would not want me to be alone forever, I know that. And he would like you, Samuel. He would approve of your strength, your skill, your kindness." "You barely know me," Samuel protested weakly. "I know you came when I was crying and needed help. I know you fixed my spinning wheel and taught me how to use it properly even though you gained nothing from it. I know you have come back again and again to check on me, to make sure I am safe and cared for. I know your hands are gentle despite your strength, and your eyes are kind despite your rough exterior. That is enough to know you are a good man, Samuel Rutherford. Samuel looked down at her, this woman who had somehow seen past all his defenses to the lonely man beneath. I am falling in love with you, Jane. I tried not to, but I cannot seem to stop it. Jane's breath caught. Good, she whispered, because I am falling in love with you too. Samuel cupped her face in his large, calloused hand, his thumb brushing across her cheek. I do not want to rush you. I know you lost your husband not long ago. If you need time, I needed time, Jane interrupted. I have had 6 months of time, of grieving and being alone and wondering if I would spend the rest of my life as a widow. But then you appeared, like an answer to prayers. I was afraid to speak out loud. I do not want to waste time being cautious when I could be happy instead. Samuel leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Jane tilted her face up to meet his, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people who had forgotten what it was like to be close to someone. But then Jane sighed against his mouth and Samuel pulled her closer, one arm wrapping around her waist, and the kiss deepened into something more. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I should probably still leave tonight. I do not want to compromise your reputation. Jane laughed softly. Samuel, I live alone in the mountains. My reputation is already compromised by the mere fact of your visits. But you are right. You should go. I want to do this properly, want to take our time even though it feels like I have been waiting for you my whole life. Samuel stood reluctantly, and Jane walked him to the door. Before he left, he pulled her close one more time, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the way she fit perfectly against his chest. I will come back the day after tomorrow, he promised. And Jane, start thinking about whether you would consider marrying a mountain man who does not have much to offer besides a strong back and a willing heart. Jane's eyes widened, then filled with tears. Are you proposing, Samuel Rutherford? Not yet, Samuel said. But I am giving you warning that I intend to. Soon. He left before she could respond, walking back through the dark forest with a lightness in his step that had not been there in years. He was in love, properly in love, and for the first time in a long time the future looked bright instead of bleak. Over the next week, Samuel visited Jane every day, no longer pretending he had other reasons for coming. They worked side by side on her blankets, which were progressing beautifully, and on various tasks around the cabin. But more than that, they talked, sharing their dreams and fears, learning each other's rhythms and quirks. Samuel told Jane about his cabin in the high mountains, about the life he had built there. It is rough, he warned. No luxuries, no comforts beyond the basics, just me and the wilderness and whatever I can hunt or trap. It sounds wonderful, Jane said honestly. I have always loved it up here in the mountains. The town felt too crowded, too noisy. Thomas and I built this cabin to get away from all that. Would you want to live even higher up? Samuel asked carefully. My cabin is more isolated than this. Jane looked at him steadily. Are you asking what I think you are asking? Samuel took her hands in his. I am asking if you would consider becoming my wife and moving to my cabin. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks. But Jane, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are meant to be mine and I am meant to be yours. Tears spilled down Jane's cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you, Samuel. I do not care if people think it is too soon or too fast. You are right, this is meant to be. Samuel pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "We will do it properly," he promised. "I will ride to Quartz Hill, talk to the circuit preacher, arrange for a wedding. We will give you time to finish your blankets, make your trade, settle your affairs here." "How long?" Jane asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "A month. Can you be ready in a month?" "I can be ready in a week," Jane said, pulling back to look up at him. "But a month is probably more practical." Samuel laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse but good. "A month it is then." They sealed the agreement with a kiss, and Samuel felt the last of his walls crumbling away. He had been so afraid of being hurt again, of losing someone he loved. But Jane was worth the risk. She was worth everything. The trading post owner arrived the following week, and Jane's 3 completed blankets were of such quality that he offered her more than she had expected. With the extra credit, she was able to purchase not only the winter supplies she needed, but also fabric for a simple wedding dress and other household items she could bring to Samuel's cabin. Samuel, true to his word, rode to Quartz Hill and spoke with the circuit preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Matthews who asked very few questions, and agreed to perform the ceremony at Jane's cabin in 3 weeks' time. He also stopped by the general store and, with money he had saved from years of trapping and trading furs, purchased several items he thought Jane might need. A good cookpot, thick wool blankets, a warm winter coat in her size, and a simple gold wedding band. When he returned to Jane's cabin with his purchases, she cried at his thoughtfulness. "You did not have to buy all this, Samuel. I do not need these things." "Maybe not need, but I want you to have them," Samuel said. "I want to take care of you, Jane. Let me." The 3 weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Samuel helped Jane pack up the belongings she wanted to bring to his cabin, carefully wrapping her precious spinning wheel and loom for transport. He made multiple trips up the mountain, carrying loads of supplies to prepare his cabin for a wife. He reinforced the structure, added more storage, even carved a proper bed frame to replace the simple platform he had been sleeping on. Jane, for her part, sewed her wedding dress from the fabric she had purchased, made curtains for Samuel's cabin windows, and prepared preserved foods to see them through the winter. She also wrote a letter to a distant cousin in Quartz Hill, explaining her plans and offering to sell her current cabin. She felt no sadness about leaving. Thomas was gone, and her future was with Samuel now. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, late October bringing the promise of winter on sharp winds. Reverend Matthews arrived at midday, along with 2 witnesses from Quartz Hill whom he had convinced to make the journey. They were an older couple, the Hendersons, who owned the general store and remembered Jane from when she used to come to town with Thomas. Jane wore her simple dress of blue calico, her hair pinned up with wild flowers Samuel had picked that morning. Samuel had trimmed his beard and pulled his long hair back, and he wore clean buckskin clothes he had made specifically for the occasion. They stood together in front of the fireplace while Reverend Matthews performed the brief ceremony, their hands clasped tight, their eyes locked on each other. When Samuel slipped the gold band onto Jane's finger, and the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed his bride with a tenderness that made Mrs. Henderson dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jane kissed him back, pouring all her hope and love and trust into that moment, and Samuel felt something settle deep in his chest. This was right. This was home. They celebrated with a simple meal that Jane had prepared, and the Hendersons shared stories and well wishes before beginning the long ride back to Quartz Hill before dark. Reverend Matthews stayed a bit longer, speaking privately with Samuel. "Take care of her," the Reverend said. "She has been through a great deal of loss for someone so young." "I will protect her with my life," Samuel promised. "I believe you will," Reverend Matthews said. "I can see the way you look at her. That is a man in love if I have ever seen one." After everyone had left, Samuel and Jane stood together in the cabin that would soon be empty of her presence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Rutherford?" Samuel asked, testing out the name. Jane smiled up at him. "I like the sound of that. And yes, I am ready. I have been ready since the day you fixed my spinning wheel." "We will take the first load tomorrow morning," Samuel said. "Make several trips over the next few days to transport everything. Then you will never have to come back here unless you want to." "I do not think I will want to," Jane admitted. "This cabin was my past. Your cabin is my future." That night, their first as husband and wife, Samuel held Jane close in the bed she had shared with another man, but there was no ghost between them. There was only the two of them, their love still new but already deep and strong. They talked late into the night, making plans for their future, dreaming out loud about the life they would build together. "I want children," Jane said softly. "Is that something you want?" Samuel felt his heart expand at the thought. "Yes," he said. "I want that very much. A family, a home. All the things I thought I had given up on." "How many?" Jane asked, a teasing note in her voice. "As many as God sees fit to bless us with," Samuel replied. "Though I hope the first is a son, someone I can teach to hunt and trap and survive in these mountains." "We will see what God decides," Jane said, snuggling closer to his warmth. "But I hope for children too. This cabin has been too quiet for too long." True to Samuel's word, they spent the next week transporting Jane's belongings up to his cabin in the high mountains. The journey was difficult, the terrain steep and rocky, but Samuel's powerful frame made light work of even the heaviest loads. He carried Jane's spinning wheel strapped to his back, making sure it arrived safely at their new home. Jane's first glimpse of Samuel's cabin took her breath away. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a clear stream running nearby and mountains rising majestically in every direction. The cabin itself was larger than she had expected, built from massive logs that Samuel had hauled and hewn himself. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and the door was made of thick planks that could withstand any storm. "Samuel, it is beautiful," Jane breathed. "It is just a cabin," Samuel said, but he looked pleased by her reaction. "Come inside, see what you think." The interior was rustic but well made, with a large fireplace, sturdy furniture Samuel had crafted himself, and windows that let in plenty of light. He had already set up a corner for her spinning wheel and loom, and the curtains she had made were hung on the windows. The bed he had built was massive, sized for his large frame, with a thick mattress and the wool blankets she had brought. "This is perfect," Jane said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "This is home." Samuel wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Our home now. I know it is not much compared to what some folks have. It is everything," Jane interrupted. "It is safe and warm, and it is ours. That is all that matters." They spent the next few days settling in, finding rhythms and routines that worked for both of them. Samuel taught Jane about his trap lines, showing her the routes and the signs to read in the forest. Jane organized the cabin, creating efficient systems for storage and work. They cooked together, ate together, slept wrapped in each other's arms, and slowly began to truly feel like husband and wife rather than two people who had rushed into marriage. Winter came early to the high mountains that year, snow falling in earnest by mid-November. But Samuel had prepared well, and their cabin was stocked with preserved foods, firewood, and all the supplies they needed. They settled into the quiet isolation of mountain winter, and Jane found that she did not mind the solitude at all. How could she be lonely when Samuel was there, his presence filling the cabin with warmth and strength? She spent her days spinning and weaving, creating blankets and clothing they would need. Samuel spent his days checking trap lines, hunting, and maintaining the cabin and its surroundings. But they always came together for meals, talking and laughing, learning each other more deeply. And at night, they lay together in the big bed, Samuel's arms creating a fortress around Jane's smaller frame, and whispered about the future they were building. By December, Jane suspected she might be pregnant, though she kept the knowledge to herself for a few more weeks to be certain. When she finally told Samuel, just before Christmas, his reaction was everything she had hoped for. His eyes went wide, then filled with tears, and he pulled her into his arms so carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby, in late summer, I think," Jane confirmed. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Samuel said. He dropped to his knees, pressing his face against Jane's still flat stomach. "I am going to be a father. I am going to have a family." Jane ran her fingers through his long hair, her own tears falling onto his head. They had both lost so much, had both been so alone, and now they were creating something new together. A child, a family, a future full of love and possibility. The winter months were harder as Jane's pregnancy progressed. Morning sickness kept her confined to the cabin for weeks, and Samuel fretted over her constantly, bringing her water and dry bread, holding her hair back when she was ill, rubbing her back when she was uncomfortable. He was so gentle, so patient, that Jane fell even more in love with him. As spring arrived and Jane's belly grew round with their child, Samuel became even more protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy work, refused to let her go outside when the ground was icy, and generally hovered over her like a worried bear. Jane found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "Samuel, I am pregnant, not dying," she said one day when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I need to stay active." "I know, I just worry," Samuel admitted. "You and this baby are everything to me. I could not bear it if something happened to either of you." Jane softened at his words, reaching up to cup his bearded face. "Nothing is going to happen. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am healthy and strong, and you will be here to help me. Everything will be fine." "You promise?" "I promise," Jane said, and sealed it with a kiss. As summer arrived, Jane grew larger and more uncomfortable, but she remained in good spirits. She had transformed their cabin into a true home, filled with small touches that made it cozy and welcoming. She had also become an excellent spinner and weaver, producing goods of such quality that Samuel was able to trade them in Quartz Hill for premium prices. In late August, just as the first hints of autumn touched the high mountain air, Jane's labor began. Samuel, despite all his strength and courage in facing wild animals and harsh wilderness, very nearly panicked. But Jane talked him through his fear, giving him tasks to complete, keeping him focused. He boiled water, gathered clean linens, and stayed by her side through every contraction, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. The birth was long and difficult, as first births often are, but when their son finally entered the world just after dawn, red-faced and screaming with healthy lungs, Samuel wept openly. He held his newborn son in his large, gentle hands, staring down at the tiny face with absolute wonder. "A son," he breathed. "We have a son, Jane." "We do," Jane said, exhausted but radiant. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son's tiny, perfect face, Samuel knew. "Thomas. We should name him Thomas after your first husband. He was a good man, and he would want this child to carry on his name." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "Are you certain?" "Samuel, you do not have to, I want to," Samuel said firmly. "Thomas brought you to these mountains, and without him, you would never have been here for me to find. He deserves to be remembered, and what better way than through our son?" "Thomas Samuel Rutherford," Jane said, testing the name. "It sounds perfect." Samuel carefully placed baby Thomas in Jane's arms, then climbed into bed beside them, creating a protective circle around his new family. "He is so small," Samuel marveled. "How can something so small be so perfect?" "He is perfect because he is ours," Jane said. "Created out of love and hope and second chances." They stayed like that for hours, the three of them together, while outside the mountain world went about its business unconcerned. Inside the cabin, a family had been born, and Samuel felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. This was what he had been missing, what he had been searching for without knowing it. Not just a wife, not just a child, but a purpose beyond survival. Something worth living for, worth fighting for, worth cherishing every single day. As baby Thomas grew through his first year, the cabin rang with sounds it had never known before. Crying and cooing, laughter and singing, the noise of life being lived fully and joyfully. Samuel proved to be a devoted father, utterly besotted with his son. He carved toys for the baby, told him stories even though Thomas was too young to understand, and walked the floor with him at night when he was fussy so Jane could rest. Jane watched her husband transform from a solitary mountain man into a family man, and her love for him deepened with every passing day. He was everything she had hoped for and more, protective and gentle, strong and kind. She could not imagine her life without him. The following spring, when Thomas was 9 months old, Jane discovered she was pregnant again. Samuel's reaction was identical to the first time. Wonder, tears, and immediate concern for her well-being. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in December, just as the first major snows fell, Jane gave birth to their daughter. They named her Caroline, and she had Samuel's gray eyes and Jane's blonde hair. Samuel was just as smitten with his daughter as he had been with his son, but there was a special tenderness in the way he held her, as if she were made of spun glass. Thomas, now walking and getting into everything, seemed fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly with his chubby hands. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm for the Rutherford family. Summers were spent with Samuel teaching Thomas about the forest and mountains, while Jane kept Caroline close and worked at her spinning wheel. Winters were cozy and intimate, the four of them snug in their cabin while snow piled high outside. Year by year, the children grew, and the love between Samuel and Jane deepened into something unshakable. When Thomas was 5 and Caroline was 4, Jane gave birth to twin boys, James and Jacob. Samuel was stunned by the double blessing, barely able to process that they now had 4 children. The cabin, while still adequate, was definitely feeling crowded, so that summer Samuel built an addition, creating separate sleeping spaces for the children. The work was hard, but Samuel attacked it with the same determination he brought to everything. And when he needed help with the heavy lifting, Thomas was there, his small hands eager to help his father. Samuel's heart swelled watching his eldest son try to emulate him, and he took time to teach Thomas properly, showing him how to measure, how to saw, how to fit joints together securely. Jane watched her family grow and thrive, and she often thought back to that September morning when she had been crying over her broken spinning wheel, certain her life was over. She had been so lost, so hopeless, convinced she would die alone in these mountains. And then Samuel had appeared like something out of a dream and fixed so much more than just her spinning wheel. He had fixed her heart, her hope, her faith in the future. As the years passed, their children grew strong and capable. Thomas became a skilled hunter and trapper like his father, while Caroline showed a talent for weaving that surpassed even Jane's abilities. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief together, but they were good-hearted boys who worked hard and loved fiercely. Through it all, Samuel and Jane remained devoted to each other. Even after years of marriage, Samuel still looked at Jane with the same wonder he had shown on their wedding day. And Jane still felt her heart skip when Samuel walked through the door after a day in the forest, his powerful frame filling the doorway, his gray eyes seeking her out immediately. One evening, after the children were all asleep, Samuel and Jane sat together on the porch he had built, watching the sun set over the mountains. Jane's head rested on Samuel's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "You ever regret it?" Jane asked quietly. "Giving up your solitary life for all this chaos?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "Not for a single second. I thought I wanted to be alone, thought I was better off without anyone to worry about or lose. But I was just scared, Jane, scared of being hurt again. You made me brave enough to risk my heart, and it has been the best decision of my life." "I was scared too," Jane admitted. "Scared I would spend the rest of my life mourning Thomas, never letting anyone else in. But you were so gentle, so patient. You fixed my spinning wheel and taught me how to use it properly, but more than that, you taught me that it was okay to love again, to hope again, to build a new life from the ruins of the old one." "We built it together," Samuel corrected. "Everything we have, we created together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. In the distance, a wolf howled, and from inside the cabin came the sound of one of the twins laughing in his sleep. These mountains that had once seemed so harsh and unforgiving were now home, filled with love and laughter and life. "How did I get so lucky?" Jane mused. "To find you when I needed you most, to build this beautiful life with you." "I ask myself the same question every day," Samuel replied. "I was just a lonely mountain man, and you were a widow crying over a broken spinning wheel. Neither of us was looking for love, but we found it anyway." "We found each other," Jane said, "and that has made all the difference." Inside the cabin, baby Jacob started to fuss and Jane started to rise, but Samuel stopped her. "I will get him. You stay here and enjoy the peace." Jane watched her husband disappear into the cabin, his broad shoulders silhouetted in the lamplight, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. They had been through so much, lost so much, but they had found each other and created something beautiful from their shared pain and loneliness. When Samuel returned with Jacob settled and sleepy in his arms, he sat back down beside Jane, the baby cradled against his chest. Jacob's tiny hand wrapped around Samuel's finger, and Jane felt tears prick her eyes at the sight of her massive, powerful husband being so gentle with their tiny son. "This is everything I never knew I wanted," Samuel said softly. "A wife who loves me, children who make me laugh, a home that feels warm and alive. You gave me all of this, Jane. You saved me just as much as I saved you." "We saved each other," Jane insisted. "That is what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from loneliness, from giving up. It gives us reason to keep going even when things are hard." Years continued to pass, and the Rutherford family became a fixture in the high mountains. Occasionally, other settlers would hear about the family living in splendid isolation and would make the trek up to visit. They always left impressed by the life Samuel and Jane had built, by the strength of their children and the obvious love between the parents. When Thomas was 15, a young woman from Quartz Hill came to visit with her family, and Samuel watched with bittersweet pride as his son fell head over heels in love. The courtship was proper and sweet, And 2 years later, Thomas married his sweetheart in the same clearing where Samuel and Jane had exchanged their vows all those years ago. Caroline followed suit at 19, marrying a kind young man who worked as a carpenter in Quartz Hill. The twins, inseparable as always, both married within a year of each other, choosing brides who were best friends so they could continue living near each other. As their children grew up and started families of their own, Samuel and Jane found themselves with an empty cabin once again. But this time, the silence was not lonely. It was peaceful, full of good memories and the satisfaction of raising children who had grown into capable, loving adults. Samuel was in his 50s now, his beard more gray than brown, but he was still strong and vital. Jane's blonde hair had silver threads running through it, and lines had formed around her eyes from years of laughter. But Samuel thought she had never been more beautiful. One autumn morning, almost exactly 30 years after the day Samuel had first found Jane crying over her broken spinning wheel, they walked together through the forest. The spinning wheel was still in their cabin, though Jane did not use it much anymore. But she had kept it carefully maintained, a reminder of how their love story had begun. "You remember that day?" Jane asked as they walked, her hand firmly clasped in Samuel's larger one. "The day you found me crying." "Every detail," Samuel said. "You were so sad, so lost. I almost kept walking, almost convinced myself it was not my business. But something made me stop, made me help." "Fate," Jane said. "Or divine providence, or just two lonely people recognizing each other across the distance." "Whatever it was, I am grateful for it every day," Samuel said. He stopped walking and pulled Jane close, wrapping his arms around her just as he had done countless times over their years together. "You are my everything, Jane Rutherford, my wife, my partner, my greatest blessing." "And you are mine," Jane replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. "My mountain man who fixed more than just my spinning wheel. You fixed my heart, my life, my future." They stood there in the forest, two people who had found love when they least expected it, who had built a life together against the odds, who had created a legacy of family and love that would endure for generations. The mountains rose around them, eternal and majestic, bearing witness to a love story that had begun with tears and a broken spinning wheel, and had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. As they walked back to their cabin hand in hand, Samuel reflected on how his life had turned out. He had thought he wanted isolation, thought he was better off alone. But Jane had taught him that the greatest strength was not in shutting people out, but in letting them in being vulnerable enough to love and be loved in return. That evening, as they sat together by the fireplace just as they had done thousands of times before, Samuel took Jane's hand and brought it to his lips. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Jane asked, though she was smiling because she knew. "For crying that day. For being vulnerable enough to let me help. For teaching me that love is worth the risk. For giving me a family, a home, a reason to be more than just a mountain man surviving alone. For everything." Jane's eyes glistened with tears. "And thank you for stopping to help a widow you did not know, for fixing her spinning wheel and teaching her how to use it better, for courting her and marrying her and building this beautiful life with her. Thank you for being my second chance, Samuel. You gave me everything I thought I had lost forever." They kissed then, a kiss that held 30 years of love, passion, joy, sorrow, triumph, and devotion. And as the fire crackled and the mountain wind whispered outside, Samuel Rutherford and Jane Rutherford sat together in their cabin, two souls who had found each other when they needed it most, and who had chosen love over loneliness, hope over despair, together over alone. Their grandchildren would visit often, filling the cabin with noise and laughter once more. And Samuel and Jane would tell them stories about the old days, about building a life in the wilderness, about the importance of family and love, and never giving up even when things seemed hopeless. But the story they told most often, the one their grandchildren never tired of hearing, was the story of how it all began. "Your grandfather found me crying over a broken spinning wheel," Jane would say, her eyes finding Samuel's across the room. "And he fixed it and taught me how to use it better. But more than that, he fixed my broken heart and taught me how to love again. Your grandmother saved me from a life of loneliness," Samuel would add, pulling Jane close. "She reminded me that being strong does not mean being alone, and that the bravest thing a person can do is risk their heart for love." And as their grandchildren listened with wide eyes, Samuel and Jane would share a smile, remembering that September morning so long ago when two lonely people had found each other in the mountains and had decided to build something beautiful together. It had not been easy, and there had been hard times along with the good, but through it all they had each other, and that had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything,